When watching a mecha anime of the more realistic variety, there's a moment when a canny viewer will ask why mecha have made tanks and planes and all the other panoply of war obsolete. Outside of pat labor, where the answer is, they haven't, there's usually a few lines of technobabble involving some kind of new power source and ultra-light, ultra-strong materials, Gundanium and palladium reactors. With a second thought, that rarely makes much sense. You could use those technologies to build an even stronger tank, after all, and still have a weapon which obeys the laws of physics. Tip speeds, ground pressures, many things get in the way of giant legs. The Gundam explanation of limbs being required for inertial dampening does not necessitate something that looks humanoid. Carcinization comes for us all. And Minovsky particles disrupting radar rings hollow if you know how effective and ubiquitous optical sensors really are. Never mind how, in anime, it always seems a gun or a missile which could be mounted on any other type of machine is made twice as effective when held by an anthropomorphic one. It's almost as if form trumps function. It's almost as if the obsession with mecha is fantasy and not thought-out speculative futurism. I was once having this exact conversation about Gasaraki, and someone said that the mecha is popular because it spiritually represents the light infantrymen reasserting themselves over mechanized warfare. And I think that's an idea worth unpacking. Warfare in this industrial era is a frightening thing. Indistinct blurs fire on each other over vast distances. Men become meat in the blink of an eye. The grit of soldiers is still a factor, but vehicles and artillery are king, the result being decided by technologies and techniques which are difficult to grasp. In anime, with mecha making the infantrymen 10 or more meters tall, closing until they can swing at each other with axes, it ironically regains a comforting humanity, even if the figures are robotic. The mecha is quite visibly an expressive extension of the pilot within, even more so when every important character gets a unique suit. I used the word regains, but like most prelapsarian fantasies, it has only a limited basis in reality. For all the hubbub about modern network-driven warfare, the foot soldier during the World Wars was little less at the mercy of disease or artillery or any number of other arbitrary threats that couldn't be overcome by being a badass fighter. Even all the way back in Hellenic antiquity, with hoplite armies fighting in phalanx, it was less cool 300 warrior antics and more a coordinated shoving match where even the most rugged and muscular individual was completely at the mercy of whether their unit broke or got outflanked. The conceit of nearly every mecha series is that individuals or a small number of main characters can be so good at killing that they basically fight wars all on their own in their custom robot suits. Who needs combined arms or organization or industry when you have plucky teenagers? Death comes not because a battery commander 50 miles away decided to eliminate your entire grid square, but after face-to-face confrontations, tense words exchanged before a clash of blades. Tanks and planes and warships are too impersonal. Conflict has to be resolved mano a mano with ideology and steel. At its campiest, the effect is that picturesque recruitment poster of war once used to push young men into the trenches. You, yes, you, can be such a good fighter that you can travel the world, kill interesting people, and entire armies or harems or the forces of history themselves will bow before you. And no, killing off a bunch of jobbers in the first episodes and growling about the cruelties of war does nothing to disperse that, since it usually serves the ultimate purpose of making the main character's plot armor shine even brighter. Another pushback I have gotten on this thesis is that mecha are less influenced by this general observation of militaria than specifically by fighter pilot movies like Top Gun. To which I respond that it's simply reaching the same point by extra steps. What does fighter plane media do if not insist that the whims of modern warfare can be bent around your balls of steel against all reason and historical precedent? An irony that both Top Gun and Macross share is that the iconic F-14 Tomcat was not designed to have thrilling dogfights with Russian fighters, but to protect the fleet by obediently lobbing giant missiles at the radar returns of bombers 100 miles away. Even before missiles and radar, air combat consisted of far more ambush, coordination, and chaos than the dramatic one-on-one duels out of the movies. So one reading of mecha anime, be they Japanese or American, is that it represents individuals, the manly men, exhibiting their strength in modern warfare against a technological paradigm which, at least in the popular imagination, makes conflict ever colder and more distant than it was yesteryear. Sometimes that manifests as a supposed return to infantry daring do, other times as gallant Red Baron fantasies. If this were an English class, you would call it a latter-day romanticism, glorifying the past and the individual. But there is another interpretation, what you might call a materialist reading. In You and the Atom Bomb, George Orwell, bear with me, wrote the following while discussing the implications of the then-new nuclear weapon. Ages in which the dominant weapon is expensive or difficult to make will tend to be ages of despotism, whereas when the dominant weapon is cheap and simple, the common people have a chance. Thus, for example, tanks, battleships, and bombing planes are inherently tyrannical weapons, while rifles, muskets, longbows, and hand grenades are inherently democratic weapons. A complex weapon makes the strong stronger, while a simple weapon, so long as there is no answer to it, gives claws to the weak. I would argue that much of the following 80-odd years put lie to his thesis that nuclear weapons would terminally ossify the world order, since nations and peoples have found other ways to compete with and disrupt each other. And Orwell seems to ignore the dramatic impacts that national industrial warfare has had on the political economy in and of itself. But I do find this argument that weapons can shape the political landscape compelling. There is something to be said for the way mecha shows tend to depict dudes with rifles and rocket launchers blowing up tanks and planes and ships, even if they are gigantic. But in a less painfully literal sense, there is often an air of disruption, revolution even, to mecha media, whether the protagonists stand for or against. Anyone with any experience with military mechanics would tell you there's no way a complex walker could be repeatedly operated out of a cave with a box of scraps. But mecha shows love to depict small fry and irregulars somehow managing to maintain a fleet of them and engaging in stand-up fights with the federales. When the protagonists are part of a military organization, it's always young people with their nifty machines stepping into or opening up the breach where the old fogies cannot, fighting righteously to place their stamp on the new order. Gundams are horse archers, dreadnoughts, or high-explosive artillery, the new technology which upsets the balance of power and forces everyone to adapt or die. But in a fictional medium where single weapons and their pilots can be so preternaturally effective, this is often in contest with that prior reading of mecha as an individualist fantasy, especially when hereditary psychic gifts are made the key to success. Can you truly have a democratic struggle in a conflict where success rests on a supernaturally gifted few? I think the most interesting series to view through these competing lenses is Universal Century Gundam. I would be far from the first to observe that the appearance of new types on the eve of the One-Year War constitutes a nascent revolution of some kind. The implication is that more and more people will be born new types, and these young savants will be the ones to ultimately resolve the conflict between the Dirt Eaters and the Space Noids from the bottom up. Gundams are especially powerful in the hands of new types and are specialized to serve them as the conflicts go on. The psychics grow in credibility and notability through their distinguished service. Surely, the young will forge a new world order in the ashes of AEUG. But what do we see a few years post-war in Zeta Gundam? Increasingly worse versions of familiar social superstructures now entirely embodied through a handful of post-human warlords taking the field in their extra shiny Gundams. The revolution has failed, or succeeded in producing something far uglier than hoped for. The individualist drive has won out, and instead of new democracy, civilian government has largely vanished. The world is effectively ruled by a handful of the most powerful mecha protagonists and antagonists, who only communicate in violence. For all my complaints about the kind of narrative post-one-year war Universal Century anime has, I think there is an extent to which this was intentional and thoughtful. Though before I give Tomino too much credit, he would have asserted that the reason this all happened is because the rootless cosmopolitan Shylocks like Melanie Hugh Carbine are playing both sides in order to reclaim the Holy Land or something. Wheeling back around to the original Mobile Suit Gundam and the One-Year War, I also think the shape of the conflict reveals a lot about the specifically Japanese mentality which led to the rise of Gundam. Gundam creators often speak to how Zeon is roughly based on the Axis powers of World War II. When you compare the early events of the One-Year War with the legend of World War II, you see the outlines of the various roles Gundams fill in the conflict. The Panzer, the Zero, the weapon systems which so upset and horrified the Allied powers. But if we specifically look to the East at large, and Japan in particular, we see a recent legacy of daring light infantry tactics being used to surprise and overcome superior Western armies. One assumes that, in the minds of many Japanese people, the pinnacle of their nation's hard power lay with their Ace Zero pilots and fanatically brave assault infantry. It all went downhill after that. So there is something particularly evocative about the way Zaku's seem to phrase a future space war in those same concepts, either elite infantry engagements or aerial duels. Perhaps there's a comfort in imagining that the future will play to one's strengths yet again. In short, mecha have taken and held their position in the pop cultural imagination because they serve as a form of future nostalgia. It allows for the depiction of futuristic conflicts, but spun around the pillars of what we remember the glorious battles of yesteryear to be. In the popular imagination, that often means a cool guy power fantasy of manly warriors turning the tides of battles by themselves. But the other side of that coin is that revolutionary Wild West fantasy, the little guys having the chance to shape the future. It's these core tensions which, I would argue, have made mecha the cultural touchstone which they are today. But yeah, war is bad, robots are rad.